Howdy, folks, and welcome back to the Dusty Trails and Tall Tales podcast. I'm your host, Matthew, and today we're riding alongside a guest who wears many hats: a novelist, historian, humorist, and all around storyteller. Scott McCrea is a 2024 Spur Award finalist, Peacemaker nominee with over 30 westerns under his belt. We're thrilled to welcome him today and talk about some of his recent work, the roots and the future of the Western genre. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hello, Matthew. And let me say, first off, that if I live to be a very old man, I could, which is tomorrow, actually, but if I live to be a very old man, I could never grow a beard like that.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to grow that thing?
I started it about during the time COVID.
Good gravy. Okay. I can't grow facial hair at all, sadly. I can paint it on.
Yeah. Well, that'll work.
Well, I try not to. They kick you out of the better bars, you know?
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about your background and what draws you to writing westerns.
I was born at a very early age and rapidly got older. No, I wanted to be a writer ever since I was in fifth grade. And I sold my first book when I was 35. So you could say I was an overnight success. And when I was a little kid, I actually hated westerns. I mean, it was the only thing on television that if it was on, I would turn it off. And PBS, the local PBS station, was playing. So I grew up in the 70s during this great nostalgia revival. So in the 70s, there was this huge resurgence of interest in pop culture from the 30s and 40s. So, they were republishing classic comic books and republishing pulp magazines, like Doc Savage and The Shadow. And a lot of mainstream movies like W.C. Fields and Me or The Abominable Dr. Phibes, for that matter, were set in period and they were really successful. And if you were a kid of a certain age, in some weird way, you were growing up in the 70s and in the 30s at the same time. And there was a show on Fridays on PBS where they would play a Max Fleischer cartoon, which I love, and a movie serial. And the first one they played was The Miracle Writer with Tom Mix. It's Tom Mix's only serial, and it's also his last movie. It's a really good serial. And you could say that I became a Western writer because of Tom Mix. And oddly enough, I ended up writing 9 books about Tom Mix. And let's see, in the interim, I've written about 30 Westerns, give or take, some for Dusty Saddles, all for Dusty Saddles, which is a great company. And I've had a lot of fun doing them. And I've written multiple series, some about marshals and some about Tom Mix and some about mountain men. And it's a great ride.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Targets West. It's more of a contemporary Western.
I'm moving my head so you can see my snazzy Targets West poster. So Targets West, or I could do this. This is even better. Folks, buy many. They're small. So Targets West is my new book, and it's a thriller. Oh, thank you. So it's vaguely a Western and vaguely a thriller. And my other sweet spot aside from Westerns has always been thrillers. I grew up, like I said, in the 70s. So, the Bond era was still big. And on television, we had the New Avengers and The Saint. And I always wanted to write a thriller. And I was always fascinated by the language of thrillers because it's very different from the language of a Western. A Western gives you the opportunity to sort of cut loose and be sort of almost poetic. And, outside of a few exceptions, like maybe Sax Rohmer or Leslie Charteris, that's not the purview of the thriller. However, it does have a very specific and peculiar cadence. And I was wondering, could I write a Western in the cadence of an Ian Fleming novels? Like what would an Ian Fleming novel look like if instead of James Bond, he wrote it about James Garner? or Clint Eastwood. So Targets West is all about an American rancher from Wyoming who's selling some Arabians to a sheikh. And the State Department asks him to keep his eyes open. And the next thing you know, he's in the middle of an international plot. And it jumps from Wyoming to New York to London to Saudi Arabia back to London. And, it's sort of like North by Northwest, but with a cowboy. And I had a lot of fun doing it, and it's been surprisingly successful. Why am I surprised? And it's been surprisingly successful. And I've already finished the sequel, which is called Prosecution League. So, and the hero is named Lucas Wheeler. And the amazing thing about Lucas Wheeler is that even though he's handsome and capable and a cowboy, he's surprisingly a lot like me. Because he's also sort of opinionated and grouchy and funny. I hope.
Do you live vicariously through your writing?
I think everybody lives vicariously through their writing. So I find that I write a lot about places that I would like to be or things that I would like to do, which I could neither go to or do. So there's that. But also, I think if you're a writer, you write a lot about people that you would like to meet that you haven't met yet. And I'm very lucky. I know a lot of really great people. But the people in my imagination are probably a little more colorful and outlandish. Well, you're a writer. I mean, isn't that the same for you?
Yeah, pretty much. How does Lucas Wheeler compare to other classic Western heroes?
He's a nice man. So I think actually, so it's more important. I think it'd be better to compare him to other thriller heroes. So you could read all 12 or 14, depending on how you want to count them, James Bond novels, and Bond is really just sort of an attitude and a suit. I mean, you know what he eats and you know what he drinks. And every now and then, you have an intimation of some interior life. But while Lucas Wheeler is a man of action, he also has a ton of interior life. In fact, in one sequence, he's handcuffed in Central Park behind his back while he's being chased by two corrupt police who are working for the sheikh. And he's rescued by a gay teenager named Stan. And after he rescues him, Stan, essentially wants to hang around Lucas all the time because who doesn't want to hang around a middle-aged cowboy? And Lucas is doing his best to push him away. Like, I'm not interested in kids. I don't like you. You're a rotten kid, blah, blah, blah. And of course, he eventually ends up virtually adopting him. And throughout the book, Lucas has real and close friendships. There's a man who works for him named Pill Hornby. He adopts Stan. He has a romance with a woman named Carla. And it's the Western hero as family man and the Western hero as father figure is a long established trope. And you don't see that with very rare exception. The only exception I could think of is John Buchan's The Conning Tower. But with very rare exceptions, you don't see that in thrillers. And so Lucas Wheeler is nicer than most heroes you find in thrillers because he's not really a thriller hero. He's a Western hero in a thriller.
We have a question comment from Mike here. It says, so much to know writing Westerns. How do you gain that knowledge for Old West detail? By research or working through it?
Oh, I make it up.
You make it up?
No. So for Western novels, there are serious Western novels, like Gates of the Alamo or Lonesome Dove. And then there are Western adventure stories. And most of my books are Western adventure stories. So knowing that somebody is using, a Navy Colt 45, or that a gig is pulled by one horse, or that hardtack is made this way, that's enough really to give it flavor. And so, for example, whenever anybody washes up, I make sure that they go to the wash basin in the corner and pour water into a thing, because I want people to know that, of course, you're not in 2025. Um, but for the types of westerns that I'm writing, I think more detail than that would slow it down. I'll tell you one thing though. My editor, a guy named Mike Matchnick, is the greatest guy in the whole world, and he often has really snarky comments in his edits, like, water doesn't flow up, or guns don't really work that way. So, more than doing research, I would say have a really good editor.
Yeah. You've written in multiple genres, haven't you? What makes the Western unique to you?
It's more honest than anything. It's they asked Gary Cooper, why did he do so many westerns? Which actually, it's funny because if you look at his filmography, he didn't make as many westerns as Randolph Scott or Joel McCrea or John Wayne, but he's remembered for his westerns. But Cooper said that there was an honesty to westerns that you didn't find in other genres, and I think that's probably why the western holds a special place in my heart. Although I've written a comic novel, and I've written a young adult novel, and I've written a pulp pastiche, and I've written a serious literary novel about Buffalo Bill Cody. So, but yeah, westerns are honest in a way that other fiction isn't, and it's also timeless. If you're writing about not only the past but a sort of idealized past, it ceases becoming timely and becomes timeless in a way that you could read a Jack Schaefer book, when he wrote them 50 years ago, and it's fresh and new, and you can read it now and it's fresh and new, and I think the Western is always fresh and new because it is timeless. That's a total word salad. I sound like Kamala Harris.
Well, in your view, what defines a Western hero?
So, a Western hero has an innate integrity that other types of heroes don't have. Certainly, like spy heroes don't have that sort of innate integrity. They can't be bought. But also, more importantly, they have connections. They have deep connections. They're connected to the land. They're connected to their families, and they're connected to their tradition. And it's that sense of connection, I think, that resonates. You would never mistake a Western hero for anything else. There's so a lot of people like it, but there's this really awful picture called, I think it's an awful picture called Time Bandits. And at the end, they're taking down the devil. And heroes from different eras come along, crusaders and knights. And at one point, the cowboys come out. It's like, oh, well, okay, now we're okay because the cowboys are here. You could always trust cowboys. You can always trust the Western hero. Did you see the recent Lone Ranger movie?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm one of the very few people, like of two of the whole world, who thinks it's fabulous. I think it's a great movie. And I think the reason it bombed, aside from it not being what a lot of people wanted, but I was okay with that, is that the overarching subtext of that movie is that the Lone Ranger is too good for us and we don't deserve him. And I think frequently that's the way I feel about real Western heroes. They're too good for us and we don't deserve them. And that goes back also to like the man who you would probably call the very first Western hero, Buffalo Bill Cody. Because aside from all of his flaws, and God knows that there were a lot of flaws, he drank like a thirsty fish. And he probably wasn't faithful to his wife. He was a great guy. He's actually probably the only person in history that I would like to have known and like to have been his friend. And that's mainly because he was a good man. And the Western hero is a good man. That's what makes him different.
Yeah.
And can I just, if I'm not mouthing off too much,
go ahead.
There's something biblical about the Western hero. I jokingly tell my better half that if you want to write a Western, just take any Old Testament story and put horses in it. and that's a Western story. But they're also people of faith and people of the word. And even in these secular times, I think that resonates, even if it's not explicitly said, it's implicitly said through the way they act and through the
Yeah.
way they think. So if I never sold another book that wasn't a Western and I spent the rest of my days writing Westerns, I'd be a happy guy because the whole world is in them.
Yeah. Why do you think the Western has such a lasting appeal? I mean, it kind of wins in popularity and then it comes back. It seems like it's making a comeback here recently. Why do you think that is?
Well, so the Western was really popular from, the time of Buffalo Bill's Wild West until, let's say, the beginning of the 70s. And a lot of that is during the 60s. We underwent injurious, terrible societal changes from which we haven't really recovered. Um, and I think we're figuring out that a lot of the 60s were a terrible mistake. And that's why I think the Western is slowly coming back. I think there's been a slow and gradual return to sanity. Um, but can we? I think also anybody can connect with the West. You don't have to be born in the United States
Yeah.
to connect with the Western, and many people of the West, we're from England, Scotland, Wales, Germany. If you went to a camp town in the Old West, you'd hear German as much as you'd hear Gaelic. So yeah, it's peculiarly American and oddly universal at the same time.
Yes. What recent Westerns, books, or films, I mean, other than your own, of course, they give you hope for the genre's future?
I mean, there are others other than mine.
Actually, I believe there's one or two.
I didn't know there were others. Let's see. Well, so I think the Longmire series is terrific. I think Justified is terrific. And oddly enough, those are like Targets West, bringing the ethos of the Old West into modern times. So I certainly do not despair. I'll tell you, I was reading Brian Garfield's book on the Westerns, which he wrote in the early 80s. And he was saying that there was nobody who's a young person now or who is being born now in the early 80s who will know or care who Wyatt Earp is. And then, of course, 10 years later, you have Wyatt Earp and Tombstone.
Yep.
So take that, Brian Garfield. But there are a lot of people writing good Westerns right now. Dusty Saddles, my publisher, actually specializes in Westerns, even though they have other imprints. And they have a stable of really talented guys like Wayne Winkle and Robert Hanlon and Casey Nash, who are regularly putting out, terrific traditional Westerns. And I think if you are a Western reader, oddly enough, believe it or not, even with the death of the mass market paperback, I think it's easier to find good Westerns now than it was in the aughts or even the 90s, because you just go to Amazon and say I need a Western. And because with the advent or the explosion of independent publishing and self-publishing, a lot of the gatekeeping that kept Westerns away from people doesn't exist anymore. Tell you a quick story about I have this book called Buffalo Bill's Last Interview. And my agent shopped it everywhere and got uniformly great notices from editors everywhere. Every one of them said, I can't publish it because it's a Western.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that also is that the gatekeepers of traditional publishing don't like Westerns, despite the fact that people love Westerns. So people who love Westerns are finding ways to get good Westerns to people who love them. And so this is actually, thanks to houses like DSP, kind of a golden age of Westerns, I
Yeah.
think.
The second golden age.
Yeah, second golden age.
Yeah,
I'm mostly brass myself, but
yeah,
I think it's the second golden age.
yeah. Because what 10, 15 years ago, there was nothing, no Western publishers around at all. They were all like imprints.
They're all imprints, or with the death of the mass market paperback now,
Yeah,
it's even going to be harder to find you know that sort of traditionally printed westerns, and a lot of the westerns that are printed by mains or published rather by mainstream houses tend to be anti-westerns or deconstructivist westerns, and that's interesting every now and then, but it's kind of a poison chalice because you can't deconstruct something constantly and have it still exist.
yeah. Well, which do you prefer writing, the traditional westerns or revisionist ones?
Um, well, so I don't consider Target's West revisionist because a revisionist western in some way, deconstructs it, that shows it was all a myth or all bogus or
Yeah,
full of toxic masculinity, and I just think it's really a contemporary. It's a contemporary western.
yeah,
I've never written a revisionist western, and I don't think I have it in me to do that because I have too much respect for the genre, and I have too much respect, I think, for the reader, because if you're writing a, a revisionist western, or even a revisionist horror novel or whatever it is, I've written one of those too, but not a revisionist one. Um, you're telling the reader that they're wrong. I don't think it's the writer's job to tell the reader that they're wrong. I think it's the writer's job to entertain them and teach them something without cramming it down their throat. But more importantly, entertain them. I'm not really a writer, in the sense, sadly and alas, that Bradbury was a writer, or that Somerset Maugham was a writer. I mean, I'd love to be, but I'm not. But I am an entertainer. And I think being an entertainer who writes is awfully good. I'm very happy I am very happy where I am.
what are some other formats you've written in? I've heard a rumor that you even write trading cards.
Oh God. So, so I've written comic strips. There was a great comic book artist named Gray Morrow, and I wrote an adaptation of Conan Doyle's The Lost World that he illustrated. But also in the 90s, you'll love this. Somebody came up, I had written a chapter. There was a book of essays about the actor Boris Karloff, who um, played the Frankenstein monster, of course, in the 30s and other things. And somebody in the 90s was going to put out a set of trading cards about Boris Karloff. And because of that chapter or that essay in that book, they contacted me and said, "Would you like to write some trading cards?" I'm like, "I've never written a trading card. I think this would be great." I also wrote a television documentary called oh God, what was it called? The Man Behind the Cape, the Jonathan Frid story about the guy who played Barnabas Collins on Dark Shadows way before you were born, because you're just a young person. How old are you?
43.
I remember when I was 43. I used to write by chiseling in rocks. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. How do you shift gears when writing for different forms of media? Is it
I
pretty
don't know
simple?
if you've noticed, but I talk a lot. So my better half says I have a fetid and overripe imagination. So it's really just putting on a different hat. I think. Yeah, so I don't know if I could write in a genre that I'm not interested in. Like I know there are romances, for example, that are really very good, but I've never read them with relish. So I don't know if I could write one. And I would have no desire to write one. And I suspect if I tried, because I don't want to, it would be bad. but I love westerns and I love thrillers and I love young adult novels and I like comedies, but I love pulp novels. So those is as easy for me as putting on some comfortable shoes. But so it's not a stretch in that they're all sort of in my wheelhouse, and I think writers who are able to jump from genre to genre don't do it because of any innate skill, but because those are their particular sweet spots. I mean, I could never write a war novel because I don't have that kind of brain. I don't have, first off, I don't have the experience, and second, I would have a lot of trouble visualizing it and visualizing it and realizing it, because it's not the way my brain works. A thriller, yeah. A war novel, no. And there are great war novels that I've read with relish. But I couldn't write one if my life depended on it.
Yeah. I recently saw a short story you wrote in the Through the Western Skies anthology about Oscar Wilde. How did he end up in the West?
Well, actually, Oscar Wilde was in the West in 1882, I think it was, when he was very young. He took a tour of the American West, where he was teaching them about the ethics of art and about the house beautiful. And he would go to mining camps, like in Leadville, and all of these, rough guys who were in the mine all day would come out with their faces covered with grime, and he'd be sitting there in a green jacket with a green carnation, sipping absinthe and smoking cigarettes and telling them about Benvenuto Cellini. And I think that there's this perception of the West is that everybody in the West said things like, well, sure, I reckon, and shucks. But I would bet actually that the average Westerner was better read than the average contemporary American. So I'm not surprised that Wilde was a big hit in the West, and I'm very proud of that story. I didn't win, sadly. A very good writer who you had on the show, Elizabeth Grace Foley, she won. But I'm very proud of that story because it's very funny, and it's also, I think, fairly moving, because the premise of the story is called Hurricane at Hogs Holler. And Hogs Holler is this small town in the middle of nowhere where Wilde is speaking. And there are two people on the train that day to come in. Oscar Wilde, who's being, welcomed by, the ladies' club and the grandees of the town, and the new town doctor, who by some clerical error happens to be a small Japanese man named Dr. Satsuma. And they had thought they were expecting someone entirely different. And while the town is lauding Wilde, they're doing their best to get rid of poor Mr. or Dr. Satsuma, until Wilde gets a wind of this and pretends to be deathly sick. And he's lying in the hotel on the divan, fanning himself with posies. And Dr. Satsuma comes in. He says, I'm sick. And all the grandees come in. He says, oh, Dr. Satsuma's coming with me on tour. And he's then going to treat Queen Victoria. And next thing you know, the town wants him. And that's kind of like life. Very frequently, you really don't get anywhere until you have an important champion come to bat for you. And I'm a big Oscar Wilde fan. Another person like Buffalo Bill Cody, a man of tremendous, catastrophic flaws, but ultimately a very good man.
Yeah. Well, how do you approach short stories differently than novels when you're writing westerns?
They go faster.
Yeah.
So a novel is like a long debate, or like a novel is like a romance, and a short story is like a quick smooch. So you write a novel the way you would plan out a romance, or the way you'd have a romance. You fall in love with this character, you fall in love with this situation, you fall in love with this plot line. And a short story is, well, kiss me quick, I'm double parked. And both are wonderful. I've been kissed while double parked, and I've had long romances too. So it's a short story is an effect. You're going for an effect, and a novel is you're going for a series of effects that culminate in some kind of resolution.
Do you plot your stories in detail, or do you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants, see where they go?
Yeah. Can I say a little bit of both? So,
Sure.
I wrote a Tom Mix Western, for example, called Cowboy Justice. It's a really good book. It's my favorite of the Tom. No, my favorite of the Tom Mix books is Tom Mix and the Wild West Christmas. But Cowboy Justice is a really good book, and I had this idea of where it was going to go, and Tom is chasing a family of outlaws, right? And one of the supporting characters is the outlaw's woman, and in my initial planning, she vanished somewhere in the middle of the book because she wasn't what the book was about. And when I got to that point, I realized that when I got to the midpoint, the biggest victim of the book was her. And then the second half of the book became, which was not what I planned at all, Tom and this fallen woman both chasing down the members of the Carlino family and killing them. And it was a race to see who got to them first. So the basic premise was there, but that twist took me completely by surprise. Like Targets West, for example, like Stan, the kid he ends up adopting, was going to show up in those 2 chapters in Central Park and then pat him on the head and get rid of him. And as he took over the book, I realized that the thing that would humanize Lucas and make us like him more was his taking care of Stan, and that was not in the plan at all. So I think if you're a writer, you have all of these sort of serendipitous things that take you by surprise all the time.
Yeah. What's your typical writing day look like? What's your process?
I sit in front of the computer and weep
Yeah.
for hours. Say, please come to me, inspiration, please. No. So it depends on the book. Depending on the book, I have a set number of words per day. And, if I am, so it, if you're like me and you're a writer, you realize that you have to do a lot of your own marketing. So I get up, I go to the computer. This is usually like right after breakfast, but before I've showered and shaved to become a person. And I spend all of 90 minutes doing the marketing that I have to do. Because if
Yeah.
you're a writer and you're not putting stuff on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and your own website, and I do this I hate it. There's nothing in the world I hate doing more than this. But if you're not doing this, you are never going to sell books. It's like
Yeah.
the writing business is 2 words: writing and business. So never underestimate the business part of it. So I do all of that for an hour or 90 minutes, depending on how long it takes. Then I take a shower and dress. And I then sit at my desk and do the word count, the daily word count for that book, whatever it is. If I do it in 4 hours, then I'm done. Sometimes I'm at the desk until 8 o'clock at night because it doesn't come. And there's a great English writer and comedian and actor and playwright and singer named Noel Coward, who you probably don't know because he died way before you were born. But he said that the thing he prized more than anything, now, this is a guy who wrote books, short stories, plays, songs, screenplays. The thing that he prizes most of all is professionalism. You can't wait for inspiration. You have to make inspiration come to you. And that's a really bitter pill for some writers to swallow. But you have to write and you have to do it and then you have to make it good. It's the last part that's hard, but for a lot of people, it's the first part that's hardest.
Yeah. Just got another question from Mike. What's your
Hello, Mike.
favorite theme or message you've ever delivered in a book?
Eat at Joe's. Favorite theme or message I ever delivered in a book. Well, oddly enough, I just written a book. Here we go, with Casey Nash and Bob Hanlon, called "Long Trail to Justice," and it's we each of us have a Western martial hero. I write about Ezra Flint, and Bob Hanlon writes about Jake Timber, and Casey Nash writes about Jubal Stone. And this is about the three marshals teaming up. It's sort of like the Avengers Assemble of Old West marshals, getting together to do this. And the man that they're taking to justice isn't as guilty as they thought he is. I mean, he's not quote unquote a good guy, but he's not a bad man. So I would say the theme that surprised me the most was nobody's beyond redemption. And then the other, I guess I would go back to Cowboy Justice, is that revenge is corrosive. I can't tell you how many times, I've wanted to take personal revenge for stuff. And I'm not talking about, shooting their children and burning their house down, but, just doing something awful in return for something
Yeah.
awful done to me. But that's really corrosive and it'll kill you. And you just don't worry about revenge. Worry about justice. And I think justice wins out in the end.
Yeah. How do you write a book when you're writing with the two other writers? Do you each write your own chapters, or do you plan and plot together? How does that process work?
So Bob Hanlon came up with the plot, pretty much. I wrote it, and Casey Nash polished it. So that was the way it worked. It's actually so far among my most successful traditional westerns. It's been in the top 30 in westerns on Amazon, in Louis L'Amour westerns, and in the top 50 in westerns overall. And it's doing nicely. So I'm very happy with that.
Yeah.
And I have to do a quick shout out to my publisher at DSP, Nick Well. I've published books with other people. I have not had a publisher who was so invested in making sure that I was successful. Usually, publishers will do what they can for your particular book, but are less than interested in your overall career. And everyone who's successful in the stable at DSP, it's because Nick has taken an interest in them and helped them grow. So I am a better writer thanks to writing these books.
That's great. We haven't having him on the show in a couple of weeks.
Oh, he's a hoot. You'll love him. He has a very heavy English accent, and he's very funny.
Yeah.
I call him up, and he rolls his own cigarettes, which is like the greatest. It's almost as good as your beard. Like, so he sits there and he rolls his cigarettes. He's like, Scotty, let's do you and Timber. I'm like, all right, sure.
Is he even more humorous than you are?
Oh, no, Nick is great. You'll love him.
Yeah. That's great. Do you have a favorite setting or time period when you write westerns?
Yes. So, you can get bogged down in the details. Like if this is 1874 and the gun is wrong, or it's 1910, and this is so. The vast majority of my westerns are set in the 1880s. It's sort of like the midpoint of the Old West. Most of the things that are important are there already. And you could say things without having to explain them overly much, So, a 6-shooter, like it could be a cult Peacemaker, it could be a Navy cult or whatever, but 6-shooter, you get away with that. If you're writing about the 1850s or the 1860s, it gets a little gummier in terms of what people need to know. And because I concentrate really on the story more than on the setting, I like the 1880s because a lot of people could just read a Western set in the 1880s and they're filling in the blanks.
Yeah. Are there any recurring themes throughout your work that you find yourself revisiting, even if it's unintentionally?
Yeah. Um, the mistakes that justice makes. Uh, the law doesn't always get it right. In fact, they often muck it up,
Yeah.
uh, both in my books and in real life. And so, yeah, that's a recurring theme. And the past. I would say the past, and I'm not talking about the past being the West. I mean people's personal past. We're all shaped one way or another by our individual histories, and I think that we carry our past with us always. There's a reason that there's the myth that when you're dying, your whole life, flashes before your eyes.
Yeah.
I personally am hoping somebody else's flashes before my eyes, but the whole idea that you are a person today and you are free of your past, I think is the most risible thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Everybody is just a composite of not only their past, but their parents' past and their brothers and sisters' past and the past of the place they grew up in. And not to sound preachy or sanctimonious, but there's a huge push in contemporary society, to reset the whole gestalt to day one. But there is no day one, starting tomorrow, because we're all made up of this stuff that happened to us and happened to our parents. There's no magical day one. And then the other thing, I'm talking much too much, but I would say the other thing that comes back in almost all of my books is that we're all in some way tragically flawed. Even even the most hero, as I'm sure you noticed, I said I admired Buffalo Bill Cody tremendously. I think he was a nice man, a great man, but he had tragic flaws. And I admired Wilde. I think he's a great man, but he had tragic flaws. And we all have flaws. And it's almost I can't understand someone writing a hero who isn't, if not flawed, at least quirky. I mean, there's got to be something there, because again, we're made up of all our histories. There's no one who is a shining knight except maybe the Lone Ranger, and even he is marred by his history. I mean, the Lone Ranger's the Lone Ranger because they murdered his brother. Otherwise, he'd be a lawyer somewhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say the past justice is murky. I mean, our individual and revenge. Yeah.
Yeah. You've mentioned Tom Mix and the Lone Ranger. I was doing some research the other day, and I found that Tom Mix was actually the inspiration for the Lone Ranger.
Yeah, he was one of the many. And so I was just thinking about the West. I'm always thinking about the Western, and I'll tell you something that I just love. This is one of my favorite stories in the world. So Tom Mix, you think of as the quintessential Westerner, right? He was
Yeah.
born in Pennsylvania, and he's a little boy. I think he's 11, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West comes through town, and his parents take young Tom, and Tom is completely beglamored by the Wild West. He wants to be Buffalo Bill, and his mother. So this is like Pennsylvania in 1890, right? Or 1891. I think he was born in 1880. Makes him a cowboy suit.
Hmm.
So there's little Tom running around in his cowboy suit, and then of course he ends up going west, and he meets Cody, and he works at the Miller 101 Wild West show, which was one of Cody's great rivals in the Wild West shows, and then it ends up being, after Cody, because he was too, the first great Western movie star. And if I'm talking too much, just tell me to shut up. But here's something that always
Okay.
here's something that always fascinated me. Um, the West is a great pageant, right? And there are two pageants we're talking about. We're talking about the historical pageant of pioneers who I admire unreservedly, going out into the wastes, um, against all odds, in very dangerous circumstances, and building a garden in a desert. I mean, so that's a great pageant. But then there's the pageant of the West, and that's Western in quotes, because while the West was still going on, the historical West, people from the West started commodifying the West and turning it into entertainment. So you had Buffalo Bill Cody and the Wild West show. So Sitting Bull, who of course is killed Custer at the Little Bighorn, spends many of his later years touring the Wild West show with Buffalo Bill. So life had become entertainment. And the fascinating thing, especially for a guy like me, is that all of these things are like bricks in a big wall. Like the first big brick is the historical truth, and then the next one is the Wild West show, and then after that, you had Pawnee Bill, and then Frank James, Jesse James's brother, had his own Wild West show, and at the same time, Ned Buntline and Street and Smith are putting together all of these Western pulp magazines, and kids in Brooklyn are reading Westerns under their bed by candlelight. They're half a country away, but the West is speaking to them. And because Buffalo Bill goes through Pennsylvania, Tom Mix decides that he wants to be a cowboy. And Tom Mix goes to California, and a classically trained Shakespearean actor, William S. Hart, says, I should make Westerns too. And he makes really serious Westerns. At the time, actually, you could say that in the 20s, Tom Mix movies are like John Wayne movies, and William S. Hart movies are like Clint Eastwood movies. I mean, they're just entirely different schools, but they were two bricks that were in the same wall. And John Wayne meets Tom Mix, who helps him get into movies, and Randolph Scott and Joel McCrea inspire Sam Peckinpah, who inspires Sergio Leone, which creates Clint Eastwood, which made things like Tombstone and Wyatt Earp possible. So when I say pageant, it's like this parade, but you can look at the first horse-drawn carriage in that parade and go all the way back because they're all connected. So, what really excites me to no end is that not whether I would hope my Westerns are good, but not whether that they're good or bad, but I'm part of a really, really long tradition. And you can take one of my books, any one of my books, and say, that's there because of Buffalo Bill. That's there because of Ned Buntline. That's there because of Tom Mix. That's there because, and we're all part of this long wagon train. And it just fascinates me to no end. And if you look at the themes and things that get repeated and circle through, they often come back to the same points and the same tropes, and that's because that's what makes the West. You're part of a great tradition. Just talking about it excites me more than you could possibly imagine. I'm like, wow, I've written these books. That makes me, the spiritual grandchild of Buffalo Bill. That makes me the spiritual godchild of Tom Mix. And it's nice to write a science fiction novel, or a horror novel, but those are so disjointed, and there's so little disunity there's so little unity of theme. But you write a Western, you're part of a really big and really important family.
Good. Well, tell us more about your Tom Mix Western series. What's the premise and how does it start?
So I wrote 9 of those. Those were the first Westerns that I ever sold. The initial plan was that the series was going to be about Tom at different periods of his life. So, Tom with Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill, and Tom, making movies in the teens, and Tom near the end of his life in the Tom Mix Circus, which was, another spiritual heir to Buffalo Bill. And then also Tom working as a marshal, because he worked at as a marshal in Dewey, Oklahoma, a night marshal. So I mean, close enough. And I had done the first one was a straight martial thriller. The second one was a little more showy because he was, in a Wild West show, and desperados had commandeered a hot air balloon on the fair grounds and whisked Tom away. That's Savage Macer. I love that book. But then somehow I just got into the habit of making them martial books because I figured as much fun as I would have about writing a book about, I don't know, Tom Mix and Bela Lugosi in the 30s, that I would be getting further and further away from what a Western was and what it does. And then when I was done with the Tom Mix books, another trope I wanted to play with was the Mountain Men book, the Mountain Men. So I had written a series of Mountain Men books, 6 of them. And then I said, I want to go back to marshals. And now my current marshal is a character named Ezra Flint, who's a very dry individual. He'd be if he was a teacher, he's the one you didn't want to get. Not because he was harsh, but because he's sort of dusty, and he's a great scholar of Marcus Aurelius, but also something of a man of mystery because nobody knows what his background is. But he's always quoting the Stoics, and I'm having a lot of fun with these because I'm writing some of them with really good people. I mean, I've done, I don't know, 8 or 9 of them, maybe 4 of them with other writers because we match up different marshals. Like I said, Bob Hanlon writes about a character named Jake Timber, who's a bounty hunter. And Jake Timber's, method of investigating is to shoot first, shoot second, shoot third, kill everyone. And if there's anyone still alive, ask a couple of questions. and then you have, Ezra Flint, who's a little more like Paladin. I mean, he's an intellectual creature and a man of letters or a man of learning. So I'm having a lot of fun with them. In fact, I'm supposed to be starting another one next week, but I don't know what it's going to be about. Don't tell Nick. Oh, and I just finished with Wayne Winkle. We started the first book of a new series, which has, I think, the very best title I've come up with. It's called Room to Die in the West. And it's all about, it's a family saga about this, the Carpenter family led by a really strong matriarch. And, most writers or many writers have somebody in mind when they're writing their characters. And I kept on thinking Barbara Stanwyck. And she has 3 sons, a marshal, a doctor, who's a drunk, by the way, and a gambler. And somebody tries to take away the family business and the mine, and the 3 brothers are sent on different trails. So you see how the doctor deals with it, and the marshal deals with it, and the gambler deals with it. And I personally, I think it's my best novel that comes out tomorrow by many.
Really?
Yeah.
Alrighty. Got one more question here from Mike.
Hello, Mike.
Will the Western always be with us? Will it ever die out or fade away?
It will only die out if the West, and by that I mean sort of the global West, dies out. If that doesn't happen, the Western will always be with us. If the West does not die out, we'll be reading. Well, I won't because I'll be dead. But we will still be reading Westerns 100 years from now, I think. Because, like I said, there's an honesty to them that you don't find in other type of fiction.
Yeah. But you've mentioned several Old West figures. If you could sit down with any of them and have a drink with one, which one would you pick?
Well, so like the first choice, of course, would be Buffalo Bill, but he drank so well and so heavily that I couldn't keep up. Believe it or not, I don't think he would be quote unquote a nice guy, or somebody I would want to know, but I would give anything for a couple of drinks with Doc Holliday. Because if you, So the historical doc is something of a mystery, but if you look at all the great Wyatt Earp movies, all the really good performances are the Doc Hollidays, and that's because they always give Doc the best lines. Whether it's Cesar Romero or Kirk Douglas, or Jason Robards or Val Kilmer, or the guy who I think did it the best, Dennis Quaid. It's a great tragedy that John Carradine didn't play Doc Holliday because he looked like him and actually was built like him. But if the Doc Holliday of reality lived up to the Doc Holliday of my imagination, that's probably the guy I wouldn't get too drunk with him because he'd probably shoot me.
Yeah.
But I would like to have tell you a quick story about John Carradine. So he was doing Arsenic and Old Lace, playing the Boris Karloff part, and I wanted to interview him because when I was a kid I loved monster pictures, and so I go into his dressing room and I said, "Oh, Mr. Carradine, I want to talk about your career. Of course, I want to talk about your John Ford movies and all of your great westerns and the historical pictures you made." He turns to me and if there was any more whiskey on his breath, the man would have combusted, right? He says, "Young man, you're here to talk about my monster pictures." So, and I if I was lucky enough to meet Doc Holliday, I'd want him to be like John Carradine, and I think I like Dennis Quaid so much because if you listen to his doc, it's not Dennis Quaid's usual voice, and I am kidding. I would love to meet Dennis Quaid. Dennis, are you listening? I'd love to meet Dennis Quaid and say, "Were you doing a conscious imitation of John Carradine?" Because there's that wonderful scene where you first see him. He's like in the bar. Remember? He goes, "Come here, Wyatt Earp," and I'm like, "Oh my god, he's doing John Carradine." So yeah, I'd love to meet Doc Holliday if I lived.
Yeah. Or are
I would
there any?
not say that Kate had a big nose either. I would just say, "Hello, Doc." But I
Yeah.
wouldn't shake hands. I wouldn't shake hands.
Yeah. Were there any? What are your biggest writing influences or your favorite writers to read? What influenced you growing up?
So Conan Doyle, number one. Conan Doyle was a huge influence on me, and I think everybody of a certain age, of a certain generation, grew up reading Sherlock Holmes stories. So I mean, it's almost impossible for me to overestimate the debt I owe to Conan Doyle. After that, I would say Ray Bradbury, of course. And then after that, I would say Somerset Maugham, and of course Oscar Wilde, who wrote funny. And even though I never am imitative of him in any way, P.G. Wodehouse, because I can't think of anybody who used language better. So, for example, instead of saying he put something in his pocket, he would say he trousered it. And I wish my brain worked that way so I could write like that, sort of effortlessly. And you could make the argument that P.G. Wodehouse wrote 50 books and they're all the same book, but that's one hell of a book. I mean, I wish I had written 50 of P.G. Wodehouse. So those are the big, and then like if you go to the second tier, it's Sir Walter Scott and John Buchan and Ian Fleming was a huge influence on me, and Sax Rohmer. Nobody reads Sax Rohmer anymore, and that's a great tragedy, I think. It's because of Sax Rohmer that I wrote Targets West.
Really?
So my agent's a great guy named Tom Cull, and before he was my agent, he still does. He has a James Bond site. And I wrote an article for his site about how Dr. No is just a rewriting, rethinking of all of Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu novels. So much so that they're actually set pieces in Dr. No that are, like almost lifted, not verbatim, but in terms of the action and the sensation and the thing that's going on. And Doctor No himself. Have you read Doctor No?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so if you remember in the movie, he sort of wears a Nehru jacket and he has
Mhm.
latex gloves because his hands are fake. But in the novel, he wears these ornate oriental robes and he has hook hands and there's this long train of his robe behind him, and Bond think he's leaves slime like a slug going across the ground. I'm like, my God, he's writing a Fu Manchu novel. So I wrote that, and a lot of people liked it. And Tom said, "You ever think of writing a spy novel?" And I'm like every alternate day, usually in the shower. So so that's how Targets West came about.
Hmm. Well, what's the best way for people to find your work?
Well, to find my work, Amazon.
Yeah.
Just go to
Yeah.
Amazon, put Scott McCrea. Papa needs a pair of boots, so
Yeah.
buy many, and buy often.
Yeah.
If you want to reach out to me, I love hearing from readers, and I have a whole bunch of friends, for example, that I made simply because they've read my books. So I'm on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, at Scott McCrea West, and I'm on Instagram at Scott McCrea West, and I'm on Facebook at Scott McCrea West. But Twitter is really mostly where I hang out, and I of course have a website called talesoftommix.com.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want our viewers to know about you that we haven't discussed?
I'm not wearing any pants. No. Uh, Anything else I want you to know? Yes. I just came back from the Western Writers of America conference in Amarillo,
Yeah.
and the WWA had some of the best people in the world. And if you write westerns, you should join a Western writers fraternity, either WWA or the Western Fictioneers. You can't go wrong either way. And then also another thing is Western writers are among the most generous people in the whole world. So if you're writing a Western and you don't know something, reach out to another Western writer, and you'll get the answer before you know it. And then I guess the final thing I'd like to do is like to shout out to your upcoming guest, Nick Whale. You can tell him I was making fun of him.
Okay. I'll be sure and do that. Right. Scott, this has been an absolute pleasure. You've got a great gift for storytelling, and I
Well,
look
thank you.
forward to seeing what you got coming out next.
Room to Die in the West,
Yeah. Be out tomorrow?
out tomorrow.
Alrighty. Well, I appreciate you being here. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time, folks.
Thank you.